and joining me today. It's been really nice to be able to come and join these meetups, given that we can't go and do our normal events in our normal way that we would do. So yeah, I'm Jennifer. I work for Butterfly Conservation, but I work on the Back from the Brink project here in the Cotswolds, which is called Limestone's Living Legacies. And I'm going to talk to you about rugged oil beetles, which are one of our target species on the project. But before I sort of get into that, I will give you a bit of a background to Back from the Brink, a bit of background to our project in particular. And we'll also look at oil beetles as a group, because it's useful to sort of get a background to them and some of the other species as well. So let's see if this will work. So yeah, so hopefully you've probably heard of Back from the Brink. Well, it's just been mentioned a few times, but if you haven't heard of the programme already, it basically started back in sort of 2017, sort of a 4-year programme of projects, and we're sort of into our final year now. It's basically been funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund and People's Postcode Lottery and several other funders. And it's funded 19 individual projects across England. And it basically came about because all of the species conservation organisations that you can see at the bottom there, so ourselves, RSPB, Plant Life, Buglife, etc., they all come together to form a new partnership called Rethink Nature. And alongside Natural England, they decided to put together this programme of projects called Back from the Brink, and go for the funding. So it's sort of a really big partnership and sort of a new way of working really within conservation. And the whole aim of Back from the Brink is really about conserving our highest priority threatened species. So the pictures on the side there show some of the species that across the projects we're conserving, but we're aiming to bring 20 species back from the brink of extinction. And across the 19 projects, we're actually conserving another 200 or over 200 more. So we're sort of working across a broad range of different species. And it's all about bringing this partnership together is meaning that we can provide this sort of integrated action and advice for all of these different species. So really aiming to do more as a partnership than we perhaps could do individually. And of course, in any conservation project, you know, we always want to inspire people to actually learn about these species, get to know them, value them, and then hopefully get involved with taking action for them as well. So as I say, we, myself and my colleague Julian, lead our Limestone's Living Legacies project, which is fun to say. And we're based here in the Cotswolds, so we're outlined there in red. And this map sort of gives you an idea. I know you won't be able to read the sort of the legend at the top, but that gives you an idea of the spread of Back from the Brink projects. So all the way from sort of Cornwall all the way up to Northumberland, a number of different projects. And they're broken down into integrated projects, which ours is one of those, which means we're working across a range of different species on a particular habitat type or within a particular part of the country. And then there's a number of single species projects as well, which obviously are just working on the one rare species individually. And we're based in the Cotswolds, and our project is working on species associated with the unimproved limestone grassland here. And the reason for that is because it's such a special habitat. There's a lot of different species associated with it, common species, but also a huge number of rarities as well. And the sort of the really interesting statistic about the limestone grassland here is that in the 1930s, this unimproved limestone grassland used to cover 40% of the total Cotswolds area. And unfortunately today that actually stands at less than 1.5%. So it's a huge drop in extent of habitat. And of course with that comes a decline in those species that are very much associated with that habitat type. But it's also important to say that actually the Cotswolds, that 1.5% actually represents over 50% of the UK's total stock of this type of grassland. So really does make the Cotswolds a very important part of the country for this habitat and the species associated with it. And so our project's really all about restoring and managing a network of limestone grassland sites. So my colleague Julian, who's the conservation officer, he does a lot of work with our partners, our local partners in the area, with local landowners, giving advice, taking volunteer groups out to do the practical on the ground work, working with contractors, all of the on the ground work that actually helps ensure the recovery and the long-term survival of these vulnerable species. And then as community engagement officer, my role is much more about working with the local community, running events, running workshops, basically getting the word out there about how special this habitat is and teaching people about the species that we're working on. So with the idea that people can then get involved with us really and come and do surveys, get involved with the practical work and take action themselves. So that's kind of where we fit in. And just to give you a little overview before we get into Rugged Oil Beetle, we've got a list, when the project was developed, a list of 30 target species was put together. So these are all species that are on the Section 41 list of the NERC Act, which basically means they're our rarest, our most threatened species in need of most conservation effort imminently. And although we work for butterfly conservation, we're by no means just working on butterflies, obviously, given the talk I'm doing today. But this just gives you a little flavour of some of the species we're working on. So, of course, there are some butterflies. So we've got the large blue, the Duke of Burgundy there at the bottom. But then there's also some bats. Got the great horseshoe bat there. Several plants, such as pasqueflower, juniper, basil thyme. There's a couple of bumblebees, which includes the ruderal bumblebee there. The adder is also on our list, and we have two beetles. So alongside Rugged Oil Beetle, we've also got this little guy on the right here, which is the rock rose pot beetle. And arguably, it's possibly our rarest, certainly most hardest to find species on the project. And after 3 years of trying, I finally saw my first one last week, which was brilliant. Because we've just recently found it on a new site, which is fantastic. So, but today, obviously, we are focusing on Rugged Oil Beetle, and I have to say, it has become one of my favourite species on the project. And don't worry if you'd never heard of it before, because I'd never heard of it. I moved from Hertfordshire to Gloucestershire 3 years ago to work on this project. So I have to say, I'm certainly not an expert on the Rugged Oil Beetle or oil beetles in general, but what I have learned over the past 3 years has really come from working really closely with people from Buglife and also John Walters, who is probably our national expert on oil beetles, who came to help us out with our very first workshop. But they're fascinating creatures. They're a nationally scarce species, and they're very much, they've like all of our species on the project, they've seen a decline and a contraction of their range over recent years. And now they're very much restricted to a number of sites in the sort of southern England, southeast Wales area. And they're very much associated with sort of calcareous grasslands, so chalk and limestone grasslands. So we've got a sort of a hotspot within the Cotswolds and also in the Mendips as well. And as I say, they're on the Section 41 list, which makes them a very important species for conserving. But before I get into Rugged Oil Beetle info, I'm just going to take a little step back just to put them within their family and have a look at the wider group of oil beetles. So I don't know how many of you have ever come across oil beetles before, but they're in the family Meloidae, and I have to apologise for my pronunciation of this, because I did ask Liam from Buglife how to pronounce it, and I'm going with that, but if anybody thinks differently, I apologise. And that's made up of a genus called Meloe, which is the true oil beetle species. And there's eight true oil beetle species, 3 of which have actually gone extinct. So we're going to be looking at the 5 remaining species. And within the Meloidae family, there are 2 other species in that group as well, which covers the Spanish fly and also the flame-shouldered blister beetle, I believe. But we're just going to be looking at the 5 today. And as a group, they're pretty large in terms of UK beetle species, up to about 3.5 centimetres in length. So they're pretty chunky little things. And they get their name because when they're threatened by a predator, they will exude this oily substance from their knee joints, you can see there. And that's sort of foul tasting. It contains a toxin called Cantharidin, which is obviously to deter predators from eating them. So alongside playing dead, they secrete this substance, and the idea is that they'll survive any predator trying to eat them. And it's quite interesting because other species want this chemical as well. So this chemical called Cantharidin is sought after by a number of other insects. So on the left there, you've got sort of biting midges, and certain species of midges actually look for oil beetles to sort of try and suck the Cantharidin out of their sort of body fluids and take it into their own tissues in order to give themselves that same protection. And then on the right there, you've got a red-headed cardinal beetle, which is basically doing the same thing. And I believe that actually female red-headed cardinal beetles actually look for males that have got the most Cantharidin within them to sort of mate with. So obviously it's to help them avoid being eaten, but also for the cardinal beetles obviously helps in terms of finding a mate. So we've got, as I say, we've got 5 species of oil beetle which are still present in the UK, and they all look fairly similar, but we will go through them so you can get to grips with each one. The top 2 are our most common, and that's the black oil beetle on the left there and the violet oil beetle on the right. And then at the bottom, the other 3 are our rarest. So we've got the Mediterranean bottom left, short-necked oil beetle in the middle, and of course, rugged oil beetle on the right. And there is a way of there are several ways you can tell them apart. Firstly, dependent on when they're active during the year. So black, violet, and short-necked, they're all spring active species, so they're adult and out and about in the spring and summer. Whereas the Mediterranean and rugged, they're active during the autumn and the winter. And then there's another difference between those. So the spring active beetles, they're very much out in the daytime, so they're diurnal, daytime active, whereas the Mediterranean and the rugged, they're nocturnal. So if we just sort of go through them one by one, because although we want to look at rugged oil beetle, there are other ones, especially black and violet, that you have much more chance of actually coming across. So really useful for you actually to know what it is you're looking at, especially if you're interested in recording. So we take the black oil beetle first. These, as I say, they're adult in the spring, active from sort of March to June, and you'll see them out in the daytime. And they're very much associated with meadows, and in particular, coastal grasslands. So if you're along the coast during the spring, sort of early summertime, and you come across an oil beetle, chances are that that's going to be a black oil beetle. So they're up to sort of 30 millimeters in length, and they've got this square-shaped thorax. So as you can see from the pictures, you've got the head, little thorax, and they're pretty much all abdomen. oil beetles. But the thorax in the black and the violet are both square shaped, and hopefully that will become apparent when we see the other beetles as well. And it is interesting with black and violet, you can tell males and females apart fairly easily because of if you look at their antennae. So in the males, which is the one on the right here, they've got very sharply kinked antennae, whereas the females, it's only sort of slightly kinked. So that's black oil beetle. Violet oil beetle, it is very similar, basically, you know, with spring active, out in the daytime, likes meadows as well, but they're much more an inland species. So most frequently, if you're inland and if you're especially alongside woodland edge, if you find an oil beetle inland alongside a woodland, you know, that's likely to be violet. Again, similar characteristics to the black oil beetle, same sort of size with that square shaped thorax. And again, in fact, these pictures probably show it even better. The male there on the right with those kinked antennae. So, and that's the female there on the left. So they're quite similar. And so far we've only really pulled them apart by their habitat type. But if we have a bit of a closer look, it is actually possible to see some additional characteristics which you can use. So I must apologise because I've actually not seen these myself, but I've been looking at the photos very carefully, and I think you can see the differences. So if we sort of highlight some of those, so we've got the violet now on the left and black on the right, and if you take the thorax first of all and look at the punctures on there, and obviously this will be a bit difficult if you don't have two side by side, but violet oil beetle, the punctures are much finer, whereas in the black oil beetle, they're larger and coarser. So that might not be quite so easy to tell if you've just got one beetle to look at. This to me looks like potentially the best way to tell them apart. If you look at the base of the thorax, certainly in these two pictures, it looks quite obvious. But how obvious it is in real life, I'm not too sure. You've certainly, on the violet oil beetle, if you have a look at the thorax there, it's got a sort of depressed sort of area, sort of squashed down area at the base, and it also sort of curves upwards as well. Whereas if you look at the black oil beetle, the lower edge of the thorax doesn't have that depressed area and is almost straight. And then a third difference, which I have to say is very difficult to see in these pictures, but is a way that you can tell them apart, is just sort of right at the bottom of the thorax there, there's a sort of a tooth sort of like structure, which is much larger in the violet oil beetle and very tiny in the black oil beetle. But again, would probably be perhaps more obvious if you actually had a beetle right in front of you and you could actually have a close-up look. So that's violet and black oil beetles. Now we're coming on to the rarities. So next is the short-necked oil beetle, a very rare species. Again, like the black and the violet, is a daytime spring-active species. Coastal grasslands, dunes and heaths are the type of area that you'll find these little guys. Bit smaller, and in this case, they actually have these rectangular shaped thoraxes, so wider than they are long. And I think these are probably, again, well, being so rare, unlikely to really see them, but they're much more sort of compact, sort of rounder, and they've got this shiny blue-black colour, so unlikely to hopefully mistake for the other oil beetles. And it was actually missing in action from 1948, was thought to be extinct. Nobody had seen it for an incredibly long time. And then it was actually rediscovered in 2006 by John Walters, I believe down in Devon, excuse me. So it's quite interesting that we have 3 other oil beetle species, which are thought to be extinct, but potentially could turn up with more survey work. And then coming on to the Mediterranean oil beetle, this is the one that basically looks very much like rugged oil beetle. So we'll have a look at the differences. Again, it's a very rare species. It's very, as I say, similar to rugged. It's out at the same time as rugged oil beetles. So it's a autumn-winter active species, emerging sort of late September through to early April. But the big difference really for rugged and Mediterranean is where you find them. So with Mediterranean, we're talking sort of coastal grasslands. So if we're finding something that looks like one of these on the coast, around the coastal grassland areas, it's most likely to be Mediterranean. But again, it's very rare. So if you were lucky enough to find one, definitely record it and get some snaps. But they're largely nocturnal, which also makes them a little bit harder to find. A little bit smaller than the violet and the black oil beetles, and like the short-necked, has got this sort of rectangular shaped thorax rather than square. And the other difference between Mediterranean and rugged is that this thorax doesn't have a little groove down the centre. So with the rugged oil beetle, there is, and we'll see that in a second. Again, this one was thought to be extinct for over 100 years, and I believe also rediscovered by John Waters in 2012. So really good news for this species as well. But of course, we're here to look at rugged oil beetle. Again, rare species, and we know that it's active in the autumn and the winter. We get the adults emerging towards the end of September into October, and then we'll be able to survey for the adults through the winter into early April. And while Mediterranean likes to be on the coastal grasslands, rugged oil beetles, they're associated with the chalk and limestone grasslands and inland as well. So that's hence why we have them here in the Cotswolds. But interestingly enough, they actually do get found in gardens quite often. And since starting the project, I've had several people tell me, several records come in saying that they've found them in their gardens, or in fact, one even turned up on somebody's slipper inside their house. So it obviously hitched a ride into the house. So, and I believe that really happens because if you live within the vicinity of these limestone grasslands, and as you'll see when we look at the life cycle, they are dispersed by solitary bees. So potentially, if you've got a suitable habitat in your garden, then they could potentially end up in there. Again, they're nocturnal, just under sort of 2 centimetres in length, got that rectangular shaped thorax. And whether you can see on this photo, there is a distinct sort of narrow groove that sort of goes down through the centre. And there's a couple of pictures coming up to sort of show the difference. And as I said, the Cotswolds is really a national stronghold in the UK for this particular species. So there we go, that's rugged oil beetle next to Mediterranean. And hopefully you can see that there's a little groove that just sort of runs down the thorax on the rugged oil beetle. Otherwise, they're quite similar. So luckily, they don't seem to, so far, overlap too much in their range, but who knows with more survey work. So I'm moving on to their life cycles now, because they really, all oil beetles have fascinating life cycles, and I'm going to sort of go through it, but I'll talk about it in terms of rugged oil beetle timing, because obviously with them being adults at different times of year, they have different timings. But I'll talk about when rugged oil beetles life cycle takes place, even though I'm afraid we don't have pictures of rugged oil beetles for all of these stages. So rugged oil beetles, they, as I say, they emerge as adults late September into early October, and before mating, they'll spend some time feeding up vegetation. I didn't realize this, but I was told just the other day that actually they do grow, they don't grow, their abdomen will expand. So they start off sort of quite, I suppose, narrow, and then with the eating, they will sort of, their abdomens do expand. So once they've fed up and they've got to, I suppose, breeding condition, then they go off looking for mates and will mate. So once mated, the female will then head for basically bare soil, somewhere that she can dig a short burrow and lay her eggs. So you've got a whole bunch of eggs there in the picture, tiny little things, and she'll lay up to about 1,000 eggs per nest. And I apparently, with the length of time these females will be adult for, certainly when it comes to black oil beetles, they can be adult for about 2 months. And apparently they can actually, they'll continue to nest and could lay anything up to about 40,000 eggs in their lifetime, which is a huge amount. But as you'll see from their life cycle, it's pretty hit and miss as to how many of those will actually make it to adulthood. So obviously they're compensating for this sort of really precarious existence by actually laying as many as they can, and then hopefully some will make it through to adulthood. So the eggs with rugged oil beetle, the females have laid their eggs in sort of the autumn and the winter. The eggs will stay underground all the way through winter until early April. Obviously the timings differ with the different species, but when the eggs hatch, they hatch into the larval form, which are called triangulins, and they get their name because of this sort of, then you can see the sort of like hook-like structure on the ends of their legs, and the reasons for having those will become apparent in a minute. And this just sort of illustrates the difference between the 5 different triangulins. You've got the violet on the left, which is very much black in colour, 2 millimeters long, and that's really the biggest. So they are tiny little things, and their main reason for being is what they're aiming to do is to climb up a flower stem and then get onto the top of the flower and basically wait for a solitary bee to come along, because the next stage of their life cycle relies on solitary bee taking them back into their nest. So just to sort of show you what that looks like, if we take the violet oil beetle triangulin, this is a picture of a whole bunch of them, which have obviously climbed out of the nest and basically climbed up this flower stem, and then they're basically sitting in wait for a bee to come along. And if we then have a look at the rugged oil beetle triangulin, which is only about 0.5 millimeter long, absolutely minuscule. Liam was lucky enough, who works for Buglife and came and did some surveys for us last year during the summer. He was actually looking for triangulins and actually managed to spot some. I don't know whether you can see them at this zoom, it's zoomed out, but if we zoom in, have a little look, there we go. We've got 3 rugged oil beetle triangulins on that buttercup, and they're absolutely tiny. So that's presumably why we don't really survey for them. We survey for the adults, much easier. And what they're basically doing is they're waiting for bees to come along, and when they do, they'll, with those sort of hooks on their feet, they grab onto the bee's fur and basically hitchhike back to the bee's nest. So if you have a little look, there's some violet oil beetle triangulins attached to this solitary bee here, and they'll be basically hoping to get back into this bee's nest. And again, when Liam came to do some surveys for us last year, he was looking at solitary bees, he actually managed to net this particular solitary bee, which actually had a rugged oil beetle triangulin attached to it, which is pretty amazing, because the chances of actually finding a triangulin attached to a bee is as you can imagine, quite low. So so that was pretty exciting. And as I say, what they're aiming to do is is to get back into the bee's nest. So what they really want to to be attached to is a female solitary bee, obviously, so as she'll be going back to provision her nest. But they actually will grab onto pretty much anything that comes along, and they don't always get it right. So that is actually a whole lot of black oil beetle triangulins attached to a solitary wasp. So yeah, they've jumped on, they've attached themselves, and whether that is sort of the end of their life cycle, who knows? They might have an opportunity to disembark, climb up another flower, but it kind of illustrates why they need to lay so many eggs, because they really have, quite a small chance of actually getting into an actual solitary bee's nest. But when they do get there, apologies for the picture below. I used this for a school presentation, and unfortunately there are no pictures of triangulins in an oil beetle's nest. But basically, when they get back to the nest, assuming they've clung on to the right solitary bee, it's a female, they'll disembark in the nest, and then they spend the rest of the time developing underground and basically munching their way through the pollen and nectar stores that the bee is actually bringing back for its own young. So, so for rugged oil beetle, they will basically, the triangulins will spend the rest of the summer within the bee's nest, eating what the bee is bringing back until end of September, when they finally emerge again as the adult rugged oil beetle. So it's a pretty involved life cycle. And as you can see, if you don't have the solitary bees, then you won't have the rugged oil beetles, because without those, they just can't complete their life cycle. So yeah, so what have we been doing on the project? Well, obviously, when it comes to wanting to conserve any rare species, you really need to know where they are and how they're doing before you can sort of embark on practical work to sort of conserve them. So Buglife have been coming to run training workshops for us. So we've done 3 workshops over the past few years. Volunteers have come along, have learned how to identify and how to survey for rugged oil beetles. And then we've gone out, we've sort of taken sites on and gone out to actually survey them. And it's a pretty simple survey. As you know, rugged oil beetles are active, are nocturnal. They become active soon after dusk, really. So as soon as it starts to get dark, you can go out and survey for them. And we're talking sort of autumn, winter, but you really want to go for the milder nights. Overcast is even better, but not going out on really cold, frosty evenings. We've sort of decided that anything below sort of 5 degrees is just too cold for them. So pick the sort of the mild nights, and it's basically a very simple search. Initially, what we aimed to do was to learn more about what sites they were on. So it was really sort of a presence-absence survey, and it's basically just go out in a group and walk the site and look for them with your torch. And it does sound pretty futile. You can possibly see the tiny little beetle that the torch is pointing at, and it can be difficult to spot them. You can get easily confused by rabbit droppings. I often think they do look like animated rabbit droppings. Or as you're moving the torch around, you can have your eye caught by the shadow of a plant seed head. But once you get your eye in for them, they're quite easy to spot. And you'll often find them along paths and sort of the shorter vegetation as well. And presumably they're doing that because they need to eventually lay their own eggs in the soil as well. And we're also logging grid references, so taking sort of 8-10 figure grid references each time we find a beetle or group of beetles, so that we can actually see their distribution through a site. And just a picture there of a mating pair, just to highlight that actually they do vary in size, and can vary in size quite markedly. So that's our surveying. And I thought I'd put this in because let's see if this will work. Hopefully it will work. A little video of a rugged oil beetle off for a walk. So for those of you who haven't seen rugged oil beetles before, and I suspect that's most people, it's just to show you what they look like really, and what they look like when they're moving. And that is pretty much top speed. So it's quite easy to get your photos, to watch them for a while, make sure you know what you're looking at, and yeah, it makes for a much easier survey in a way than things like bees and butterflies which on a hot day zip past and you've got almost no chance of seeing them. So that's rugged oil beetle at top speed. Oh, go to the next one. So yeah, before the project sort of started, which was around it was 2017, there were 7 known sites in the Cotswolds AOMB. So this is the boundary. The purple line shows the boundary of the Cotswolds, and I've zoomed in around the sort of central part of the Cotswolds here. So I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but we've got Stroud sort of to the left, the west of the Cotswold, the centre there, Cirencester over in the east, and Gloucester a bit further north, just outside the boundary. And so we're sort of looking at the sort of the central Cotswolds area to begin with, and which is where you've got a real hub of this limestone grassland habitat. Obviously, that's only showing 6 of the sites. The 7th one is down near Bath, but it was just easier to stay a bit closer zoomed in. And at this time, the best known site is a site called Swift's Hill, which is in the Slad Valley, and this is a Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust site. And I think at the time, if I remember rightly, when John Walters came to do our workshop, and he knew the site very well, I think his sort of top count was sort of around in the 30s. So of these sites, it was certainly the best known site. And then since we've been out and our volunteers have been out, and we've had about 20 or so people take on surveys, and we've covered, I think, about 14 or 15 different sites, we've actually added 10 new sites to the list. Well, we've added, with our volunteers, we've added 7, and then another 3 were added by Natural England's team, and 1 by a local naturalist as well. But we've since been surveying these sort of regularly, and have a lot of new data for these sites. And it's absolutely fantastic to have actually found so many new sites. It just shows, what it actually shows is it's a result of under recording. So we can't claim that it's actually anything really to do with the work at the moment that we've been doing in terms of on the ground work, but it's really because this beetle has been just under recorded. And it's really not hard to see why. I mean, you have to go out in the dark, in the middle of winter, with a torch, and it's cold. So it's probably the most antisocial survey that we do. So it's not surprising that people haven't been seeing them all that much. But it just shows that we really do have a real important population of them here. And we haven't even really managed to get to look even much further afield than this, because obviously it takes quite a lot of effort just to cover this many sites anyway. But so it really is it's still a very nationally scarce beetle, but it can be locally abundant in some places. And just to highlight a few of the real nice results that we've turned up, there's a site called Painswick Beacon, which is just north of the village of Painswick. And I think our top count there was 59 on one night. And I'm pretty sure we would have got more, but after about 2 hours, you can't feel your fingers, so you kind of have to stop. But that was really good. And actually the first one we found there was by my colleague Julian, and he found one out during the daytime, which led us to go and actually have a proper look. Not meant to be out during the daytime, but does happen occasionally. Then we've been out to, well, a number of sites, but this particular one called Juniper Hill, which is absolutely fantastic. And myself and a volunteer went there a couple of years ago for the first time, and looked throughout the whole site. And when we eventually totted up our totals at the end, we counted a total of 90, which was by far and away the highest total, certainly of the counts in the Cotswolds that I'm aware of. And not such a high count, but one that is quite nice to flag up, which is a site called Rogborough Common, which is absolutely stunning, fantastic site just south of Stroud, which is a National Trust site. Has lots of different rarities on that site anyway. And we just assumed we would find rugged oil beetles really quite easily, but it took about 5 or 6 surveys before we actually found 3. So we were very pleased to find 3. But we think it's perhaps because the slopes, there's a lot of south-facing slopes where we expected to find them, but because they'd become sort of undergrazed and had become quite long grass, quite rank, that might have been stopping the solitary bees nesting, not having enough open bare soil in which to nest. But Julian, with the funding that we have, has purchased electric fencing, and now we've got paddock grazing taking place on the slopes of Rogborough Common. So working with the commoners and the National Trust, and that's getting the slopes back into really fantastic condition. So I'm hoping that 3, as we survey in future years, will actually start to see more, because there'll be more opportunities for the solitary bees and for the rugged oil beetles to nest. And then just to flag up these 2, which are obviously outside the Cotswolds boundary, these were located by a couple of volunteers who also volunteered for Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. And they took it upon themselves to go and have a look at these GWT sites, and unbelievably found them there as well. So it's really just showing that actually it's worth looking anywhere around here, because you may well turn them up anywhere. And then just to sort of show the results, once we've taken the grid references, obviously we can then map across a site. This is Juniper Hill, and that's after we found the 90 beetles, and you can sort of see the spread across a site. So that's really useful when it comes to management of a site. So we can give this to a landowner, and we can say this is the area they're found in, and how to manage for them. Right. So that's the sort of survey work that we've been doing. But although it's really useful to know about more sites and to know distributions across more sites, there is actually still quite a lot that we don't know about this species. And I know John Walters and Buglife and some other people have been trying to, over the years, do more research, but it's still unknown as to which the host bee species is. So I've been going on about they need solitary bees to complete their life cycle, but we actually don't know what solitary bee species, or maybe it's more than one species, is the actual host. So Liam from Buglife has been able to actually put aside some time, and last year he came out to 5 of our known rugged oil beetle sites, and the aim was to sort of document, survey all the solitary bees that were at these sites, and so create a list of all the solitary bees that he's found, with the idea of whittling down which might be the host species. So it's going to be obviously incredibly difficult to be 100% sure that we know what the host bee species is. You'd probably have to dig up the nest and see if there was triangulins in there. So obviously don't want to do that. So by creating a list of bees at each site and then seeing which are the common species across the sites, we can at least maybe whittle it down and see which might be the most the potential hosts. So just to say that the top photo there is Painswick Beacon, and this is the slope where we found those 59 beetles. So it's really a good area for them there. And the bottom photo is Juniper Hill. And that's just showing some of it's an old quarry site, so there's lots of bare soil, lots of banks and paths, so lots of opportunities for solitary bees to nest in. So he visited these 5 sites, and so his initial results back were that he found that there were 34 different solitary bee species discovered across all of them, and 9 of them were present at 3 or more of the 5 study sites. So in sort of thinking about it, decided that those were probably the most likely hosts. So we've got 3 of them just highlighted here, which is the ashy mining bee, grey-patched mining bee, and the bronze furrow bee. And I think across I think there was Andrena, Halictus, and Lacea glossum, I think, are the genera that these all fell into. So all sort of mining bee species. And yeah, we can't be 100% sure, but this is basically a good starting point. So we'd love to do some more research on this, and other people will no doubt want to take this and do a bit more research with it. But a really nice sort of short list of which might be the host species. And of course, we would have been he would have been out doing more of this spring, but unfortunately, due to lockdown, we unfortunately missed this season. But yeah, so that's an extra piece of work we didn't expect to be able to do, but it's been nice that we have at least been able to start having a look at this. So I'm almost done. I hope I haven't lost anybody. But just a couple more slides, just to again flag up, there is not just the host beetles, host bee species to learn about, but I do, just from our additional observations, there's certainly a lot more we could research, we could look into, including their specific habitat requirements. They need the bare soil, as I've talked about, but it does seem that they do need longer vegetation as well, so tussocks, longer areas. The picture on the left, it shows the Painswick Beacon ramparts, and just to say, on the right hand side of it is the south-facing bank. And before the early part of the autumn, we found, this wasn't very scientific, but we found all of our beetles on that side. By the time we came back after there'd been a lot of snowfall, we found them on the north-facing bank, where that doesn't really get grazed. For some reason, it doesn't ever get grazed down as much as the south-facing bank. And really anecdotal, but it just seemed that they might have moved themselves from the very short grazed area into the longer area, which kind of makes sense if you've got a covering of snow, it's frosty, they need cover as well. So there could be something in doing a bit more research into the need for longer vegetation, the need for maintaining tussocky areas, because obviously that will impact on how we manage our grasslands, of course. So that's kind of everything we've been up to. But I just wanted to, before I finish, flag up Buglife's Oil Beetle survey. So if any of you are sort of in the Cotswolds area, you're more than welcome to come and join us for our next workshop, which, fingers crossed, we will be able to run. We normally run it in about October time, but I'm sure you're all far and wide, but you can get involved with the oil beetle hunt that Buglife run. And if you go to their website, you can find their page where you can submit records, and you can download their leaflets, their ID guides, and actually know what you're looking at and submit your records as you find them. So I think that's me done. Thank you very much, and happy to take some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. It was
I can see people again.
Yes, they've appeared again now.
I'm talking to a screen.
Yes, if any of you have seen a few questions come in already, but please do post in the chat box or raise your hand, and then we'll start going through those now.
Fine answer.
There was one from Chris slightly earlier, just asking, are you able to disclose the site near Bath? Because they're based near there and have had a colony on their front lawn for 3 years. So curious to know where else they are locally.
Oh, okay. I wonder if Chris has been in touch before, potentially. I might be able to do that. I don't know off the top of my head, because actually we haven't actually ventured down there ourselves. We've pretty much stayed more locally around the Stroud area. But yeah, Chris could get in touch, and then we could maybe let him know, or pass him to the record centre down there to find out. Yeah.
And Jennifer, do you have a way that Chris can record his colony with you as well? Because it seems like that might be.
Yeah, well, I think as I say, if it's the Chris who's been in touch before, I think he had been sending his records to his local county recorder. So certainly somebody who's been in touch before about having rugged oil beetles on his lawn, yeah, which is pretty special.
Okay, so it's a case of get in touch with your county recorder or your local.
Yeah, if your local beetle county recorder is always your sort of best bet if you can do that, and you can record that way. Yeah.
Thank you. Lawrence, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much, by the way. That was fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Just wondered if you know how, you said you're not sure what the host species for the rugged oil beetle is. Do you know how specific the other UK species are with their host species?
I'm not too sure, because as I say, we've just been focusing on rugged oil beetle in this project. I mean, I haven't heard, in discussion with Buglife, I haven't heard them mention we know the host bees of the other species. So I have a feeling that it's fairly unknown across the board, mainly because it is that difficult to identify them, because to know for sure, you probably have to, because just finding the triangulins on a bee is not necessarily going to tell you the host, because obviously they will grab onto anything. So you could find them on something, but they don't complete their life cycle because it's the wrong thing. So I suppose short of digging up a nest and seeing if they're in there, and or focusing on a nest and actually seeing the beetle come out, it's got to be quite difficult. But yeah, I mean, I'd suggest perhaps contacting perhaps Buglife or something for a more specific answer. But as I say, I haven't heard of anybody mention that they know that it is a particular species for the other oil beetles. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Sorry.
Got a question from Mia asking, do you know what caused the decline in the rugged oil beetle? Is it habitat loss or also solitary bee declines? It's
probably that. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've lost a huge amount of the limestone grassland in the Cotswolds, but we've also, I think, nationally, in terms of wildflower grasslands of all types, I think it's something like 97% since the Second World War, or some horrendous decline. And of course, they very much rely on the bees to complete their life cycle, and the bees obviously need the flowers, the diversity of wildflowers, to collect their pollen and their nectar. So if you're decreasing your extent of wildflower meadows, then obviously you lose the solitary bees, and then you won't have the rugged oil beetles there either. So yeah, we have to assume that it's probably down to habitat loss mainly. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's right.
Bear with me. I've got a few questions here.
That's all right.
Oh, that's quite a good one. Elspeth's asked, has there been any attempts to raise the triangulins artificially?
Oh, that would be interesting. Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think. Yeah, I've never heard anybody say that. Yeah, goodness, that would be maybe. Do you know what? I actually think there are probably a lot of potential PhD projects that could come out of just rugged oil beetle, because there are so many questions, and you know, you probably could set up some sort of experiment to actually raise them, you know, with different host bee species or something, and maybe that's the way to do it. But yeah, not that I'm aware of. We'll keep it in mind.
Yeah, I was thinking that as you were talking about all the different PhD projects that could come from this.
I know, there's a lot, definitely a lot.
We've got a question from Graham here, who's based locally, just moved to Stroud, in walking distance of Rudborough.
Yeah.
He's called Swift's Hill, hasn't heard of Juniper Hill, so he's going to try having a look there. But he was wondering, has Salsey Common been tried when you were out in the
Yeah, funnily enough, I went into to do a talk with the Cubs group there, and they took it on, the Selsley Cub Pack, and we took them out one night to try and look for rugged oil beetles, which was fun. Sadly, we didn't find any. The problem with Selsley is that I don't think it's got very obvious south-facing slopes. It's a bit more north-facing, northwest-facing. It's got a lot of old sort of quarry areas, so you have got possibilities. So it could certainly it certainly has potential, but perhaps not so much as some of the other sites. But yeah, haven't discovered it yet. So if Graham wants to get involved, he's more than welcome to come and help us this autumn.
There we go. Another question here from CM. They were asking that the rugged oil beetles are undersurveyed. Do you think that potentially that could be a reason why they're seen as threatened, just because they're undersurveyed? And do you think that further surveying could find that they're actually not that rare?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because obviously we found lots, and so it does make you go, gosh, are they really rare? But they're obviously, you know, from past surveys elsewhere in the country, you know, they haven't been picked up in other in other parts of the country. So there certainly is this southern sort of southwestern distribution. So yeah, they may well be more locally abundant than we knew of, and obviously we have been picking them up in sites that we didn't know they were there before. So yeah, under recording is obviously a big issue for a lot of species. You know, if we don't have people recording, we don't know how exactly how rare something is. But I mean, I think from past research from other people who've been involved with oil beetles over many years, they would still say it is a nationally scarce species, but we're just finding that this stronghold here in the Cotswolds has more than we perhaps thought. So it probably is the best area in the country for them. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. We've got a question from Jenny here, asking, what is it about limestone grasslands that rugged oil beetles like?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, I think there's stuff in there we don't understand yet. I think there's probably more to be learnt about their exact habitat requirements, but there'll be, because we're almost looking more at what the bees need in a way, because if we don't have the bees, then we won't have the rugged oil beetles. So it's obviously the solitary bees are getting a lot out of these grasslands, which is probably the diversity of wildflowers, the opportunities for nesting, the fact that a lot of these sites are on hillsides, so that's why a lot of them are still exist, because they weren't possible to build on or to farm. So that's why the remaining sites are where they are. So you've got the combination of the diversity of wildflowers, the bare soils, especially where you've got good grazing, breaking up the vegetation, opening up those gaps, and the south-facing aspect as well, which is obviously all providing those fantastic conditions for bees, because they don't really have to, they can forage and they can nest within the sort of same area. So whether there's more to it than that, I think is perhaps perhaps yet to be understood. But certainly the bees, and there's probably specific requirements that some of those bees have as well within those grasslands. So yeah, there's a lot of unanswered questions, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Another good question from Mia, asking, do the oil beetles use pheromones to lure solitary bees to flowers?
Oh yeah, not something I've heard of. See, I think I'm going to have to start writing some of these down, because I think we're going to have to come up, by the time our project ends, I'm going to have a really long list of questions for PhD students. It's not something I've ever heard mentioned. It really, from what we know at the moment, it is basically a case of climb to the nearest flower and wait. What I did speak to Liam about the other day when we were preparing this presentation is that those two pictures I showed of triangulins on a flower, they're both on yellow flowers. And I wasn't sure whether that was just a product of the fact that it's springtime and we have a lot of yellow flowers at the beginning of spring. But he did put forward maybe a theory that there's something in choosing a yellow flower. Perhaps bees are more likely to go to a yellow flower. Maybe there's something in the way they see in UV. So yeah, maybe they are seeking out yellow flowers specifically, but I'm not sure about pheromones. But again, something that could, I'm sure, be researched at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Got a question from Caroline. I'm not quite sure which, I think it was the slides earlier maybe she's referring to. She was asking, could she have the name of the other 6 bees that you're talking about?
Oh, without having a look at it, the other 6 bees. Gosh, now I'm going to have a quick look and see where it was. She might have to drop me in a message for that one, because I'm trying to have a quick look and see.
I can put that in the follow-up email if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can try and figure that out. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
It might be worth, Holly, adding a link to the solitary bee nesting ecology virtual meetup that we did a few weeks back.
Yeah,
as well, because there's strong links I see between.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay. Conscious of time, I'm going to start. We've got
lots
of.
I talked for a bit too long.
No, don't worry. I'm going to just make sure I get them all. I've got another question from Jenny, asking, do all oil beetles need solitary bees to complete their life cycle?
Yeah, I believe so. Yes, I think they're all very much reliant on solitary bees. And as I say, we don't know exactly what needs what, but yeah, that's a big part of oil beetles' life cycle. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we've got another one from Elspeth, asking, how easy would it be to rear the 9 or so solitary bees and then introduce triangulins to them?
Well, I think we have a volunteer. I'm sure.
Yeah.
She's volunteering. I think she needs to get in touch and we'll set it up.
Yeah, I'll put you in touch, Elspeth. I can see her on there laughing.
I have no idea how easy that would be. I like the idea.
Okay. I think, oh no, sorry, we've got another one here. So this was going back to before when you were talking about the yellow flowers potentially being useful. Thomas was asking, could it be that the colour of the flower attracts the beetle, or the flower itself is attracting the rugged oil in some way? I
sort of missed that. It's attracting the bees, did you say?
Well, beetle, I think perhaps he means bees in that one. Earlier, that bees tend to go to yellow and blue flowers.
Yeah, that was certainly something that we were talking about the other day, whether there is something in the yellow that that is attracting the bees. perhaps more so than other flowers at that time of year when they're out. Yeah, it could well be. Again, another PhD project right there.
Yeah. Right, I will squeeze in one more question and then we'll finish. Another question from Graham, who's saying, other than their risky lifestyle and habitat, do you think there might be parasites that might be affecting their year-to-year numbers?
Well, I suppose there could be. Again, it's not something I've ever heard anybody mention. And one thing I did forget to mention is that actually I talked about the cantharidin that the beetles sort of secrete in the oil, and they have it in their bodies. Apparently that's also within the eggs as well, because I was thinking, oh, it's quite risky, you know, that nest is unprotected, she just covers it over with soil, and then there's eggs potentially there just to be eaten by something else. But the eggs also have the cantharidin within them as well, to avoid being eaten. So they've obviously got quite good sort of predator avoidance mechanisms throughout their sort of their life cycle, really, from egg to adult. But yeah, it could still be, and there could be something that's affecting them. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really be 100% sure on some of these questions. It just shows you how many things we don't really know about this species, which does make it quite exciting, actually, because you can sort of put forward these theories, and you know, just in the surveys we've been doing, we've been like, does that affect them? You know, we're seeing, you know, talking about the tussocks in the cold weather, we're seeing them closer to tussocks. Are they really important? We don't 100% know how they use them yet, but you know, knowing this little in a way about this species does mean you can theorize, and there's so much more to be learned, really.
Yeah, that's great. We do have a few more questions in the chat, but we have run out of time. So what I'll do, I'll ask Jennifer those afterwards, and I'll send them round in the follow-up email.
Gives me time to think about them as well.
Management, yeah, exactly. But that's it for today, everyone. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today and taking time for that talk. It's really, really interesting. And a big thanks to all of you for joining us on this boiling hot Wednesday afternoon. I'm melting in here now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you for staying in on such a nice afternoon. But you can go and enjoy it now.
Yeah, and I'll send those links to everyone afterwards in the follow-up email for the Oil Beetle survey and all those things. So
brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye.